Just a quick video on a study I had seen, another popular media lie fest. It's the best way I can describe it. It sounds very juvenile to say it that way, but I don't know how to describe it. Just blatant lies and narrative forming. I don't know if you saw this last month. I was going to release it, but it was around Christmas. I'm like, I'm not going to get upset over Christmas time for this foolishness. But this is more of a therapeutic thing. I know all of you out there probably saw through this immediately. But this popular media ran with this study. And it reminds me of the one, it reminds me of a lot of things that this happens. But I put up a video about climate change and kids' long-term physical activity, which was completely crap. The inference from the study had nothing to do with, and it wasn't even a study, it was a review paper. Well, a similar thing happened here with this increase in sudden deaths that we're seeing in the last 2 years. Now, I would argue that something else has happened in the last 2 years that may be more at fault, but I'll leave that there. What I wanted to focus on is these sudden deaths were attributed to sweeteners, artificial sweeteners. And it cited a study that linked sweeteners to not sudden death. This is the absurdity of this stuff. So the actual study, I'll put a link in the description of the video. It's an open access study. You can go look at it yourself. It used hazard ratios, which is fine. I'm not knocking that. I mean, in a derogatory way. But it looked at high sweetener consuming individuals versus low sweetener consuming. There was and a no sweetener consuming individuals. Hazard ratio just kind of looked, and this was over 2009 to 2021, and looked at mortality associated with these individuals. Or sorry, looked at cardiovascular disease, not mortality, cardiovascular disease and cerebral vascular disease, so like stroke and stuff like that, over 2009 to 2021, and looking at then the hazard ratio. So is there an increase in the likelihood of somebody dying or somebody incurring one of these diseases as a result, and potentially dying as a result of consuming sweeteners? There's 3 common sweeteners. 2 of them where you recognize. They're all 3 typically in drinks and other things, but sucralose and aspartame. And AK was in there too. But looking at the effects of these sweeteners, well, a hazard ratio has a referent of 1. So if you get a hazard ratio of 1 between 2 groups, that means in this case the sweetener consuming group and high sweetener consuming group, which wasn't really high. That really. I didn't think it was that high. The daily intake was considered high. This was a study in a French cohort of over 100,000 people, by the way. These are big database studies. You can go in and just ask us a question of the database. So interesting study. But they looked at these 3 sweeteners as an aggregate, and then looked at them separately, and looked at these 2 disease conditions, cardiovascular disease and cerebral vascular disease. So anyway, the hazard ratio of 1 would indicate there was no difference between the 2. Like, people die just as fast as one or the other. If it's lower than 1, that would indicate the sweetener group people, high consumption people, it was actually beneficial. Okay, and if the referent was over 1, or the outcome was over 1, that would mean that the diet, or the sweetener, I keep saying diet, the sweetener consuming group had a higher likelihood of cardiovascular disease, cerebral vascular disease. Okay, so the outcome of the study. When you put all the sweeteners together, around each one of these numbers is called a confidence interval. So 90% confidence that the actual value falls between these 2 set of values. And so if you look at the range of values, you'll see that many times, even if the actual hazard ratio is 1.09, it might even dip under 1, meaning that, I don't know, now it could go even higher. It could go up to 1.7 or something. No, that's not that high. 1.17 or something like that. And so the way to interpret that is like 17% higher likelihood of incurring cardiovascular disease if it was 1.17 by consuming the sweetener group as compared to not consuming the sweeteners, right? But if you look at the confidence interval range, for the most part, they weren't really conclusive, right? You'd want really tight confidence intervals. That way you could draw more definitive conclusions. So there's that problem. The other problem was if you look at the demographics, even though I was reading through it and it appeared they try to control for, I say tried, I was trying to understand, I believe they did control for it in their model. But even so, just looking at the difference between the groups of the high consumption sweetener group versus the no consumption group, clearly different health outcomes, right? Or it's clearly different demographics, I'm sorry. So like the BMI scores, for example. the vegetable intake, even if it wasn't a tremendous amount, it was still statistically significant. It was different, statistically different, right? Significant difference. I don't know why I have a hard time saying all this one. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Probably the biggest marker was smoking. So the high consumption group either were smokers or were smoking at a higher percentage than those in the non-consumption group. So what I'm getting at is if you go look through the study, I think it's table 1, it had all their demographics, is these were different group of people. Now it's the whole chicken and egg thing again. You could argue, well, the people who are consuming sweeteners did all these other things as a result of consuming sweeteners. I find that unlikely, but you could say it that way. More than likely is this group of individuals were consuming consuming sweeteners to try to mitigate some of the other bad things they were doing, or they were trying to regain control of their health, quote unquote, regain control of their health by lowering their sugar intake, which it didn't work, and with these sweeteners. So the actual study itself, it's interesting to think about that maybe the use of artificial sweeteners maybe wasn't helping these individuals to control other dietary issues. And by the way, I consume artificial sweeteners. I'm not against them. I have my concerns about them, but I don't have enough evidence to. I always tell people I would avoid them as much as you can, but I consume diet drinks just because I'm weird and I like the flavor. I know that's strange, but I've limited my intake of those as well. So I'm not telling you one way or the other. I know a lot of you out there may be like, you can't touch that stuff. Your microbiome and da da da. Maybe. I'm not discounting that, but I don't have enough evidence to say yes or no. I believe, though, what's at work here is what's usually at work with a lot of these, like when we see a lot of this contrary information in the nutrition sciences, and that's back to this idea of opportunity costs. If you're consuming one thing, you are not consuming the other. We focus so much on what we eat and drink. A lot of times we don't focus on what we're not eating and not drinking by consuming these other things. So if you're saying, well, I'm gonna pound the diet drinks as a way of avoiding eating. Well, part of that eating might be eating fruits and vegetables. That would be a good thing. If you want to pound anything, pound that, right? That would be a really good thing to eat a lot of, right? But by not eating now, we also are not as full as we were. And we're drinking things, mostly these sugar alcohols are in drinks primarily. I know they're in bars and stuff like that too, but that's also going to make eating more likely. And so the negative outcomes that may exist from sweeteners, and by the way, the results of this depended on the sweetener, but overall, like if you compiled all the sweeteners together, I wasn't compelled that sweeteners help reduce cardiovascular disease or cerebral vascular disease, nor do they hurt, right? And there were some odds ratios that we're getting, in the 1.33 range, in the cerebral vascular. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. It was in sucralose in particular, if I remember right. And you can go look at those, but I still wasn't anything that would compel me to think that sweeteners were a problem from this study. And on the other side, though, I didn't see anything that would say to me that sweeteners were helpful either for those that trying to lose weight. I think there's a lot of individuality here for some people like myself that grew up drinking 2 liters of soda a day with the real stuff. Maybe a diet soda is helpful to mitigate some of that. I don't know. For others, it may not be that big of a deal, or when it's overconsumed at the expense of other food, that's when it becomes a problem. And I think you'll see this over and over again in the research literature. If you think about that opportunity cost issue, like when we look at the red meat studies and whatever they are, when somebody is consuming one particular food, and especially if it's unhealthy, they're not consuming something else. So it may not even be the food that they're over-consuming, maybe the food they're not consuming. In fact, just as I said that, it reminded me that I remember the high consumption group in this study also consumed quite a bit more ultra-processed food than the low consumption group. So there's just a lot of factors about the study that give me pause. And there's some interesting data in there that needs to be triangulated with other data. But the part that irritates me is not the study itself, because that's just research. That's just using critical thinking. It's what popular media did with that study. It has nothing to do with sudden death. Zero to do with sudden death. It's just bizarre. So I hope he didn't fall for that. If he did, it's okay. I fall for stuff all the time. And the older I get, I literally fall sometimes. So, but don't, when you see these popular media study articles latch onto a study, and this was not original research in the sense they did any sort of like experimental condition. It was original in the sense that they went through a database and they pulled a lot of records and did some interesting research with it. Like they ran, I think, a great question. So again, I don't have a problem with the study. I think it needs to be interpreted carefully. But what I do have a problem with is popular media taking something that wasn't there yet again and running with it. So I hope that's helpful to you as you're reading this. You might be, maybe you read popular media and you're like, what the heck? What is eggs good or bad? What is it? Well, read the study. And a lot of times you find it's a nothing burger, right? What has been, in that climate change one I mentioned, they took a quote out of that review article and ran with it. It wasn't even original research. It wasn't even pertaining to what even the author was trying to articulate necessarily. It was just a fact. And then popular media turned it into the fact related to the review article and turned into something it wasn't entirely. So I get irritated with that crap. We need to be critical thinkers. And if we are, a lot of this nutritional misinformation we see and confusion will subside. It will subside, especially if you keep in mind this idea of opportunity costs. It's such a big deal in nutrition literature. I can't emphasize that enough. Opportunity costs. All right. See you guys in the next video.